We're going to get started on the keynote panel address today. So I'm going to give some background and context. And it starts with this for me. I'm really kind of over keynote addresses where one person gets paid exorbitant amounts of money to be the expert on everything. I'm done with that white supremacy culture thinking. I don't really do that anymore. I really like groups of people talking together. So that's number one. That's why we don't have a keynote speaker. We have a keynote panel. Number two, when I started this job in January, there's a lot of information and misinformation and disinformation and counterinformation about race and social justice initiative in the city of Seattle. There's a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different takes, a lot of different, interpretations. And so I thought to myself, well, what we really need to do when we have the summit is we need to get the history told of RSJI and what it is, how it is, where it came from, and where it is now and where it's going. But then subsequently I actually found out in doing research that people try to do this all the time. Every 2 or 3 years, there's some effort to sort of say, this is what RSJI is, this is where it came from. So what we need to do is to get in a practice of embedding our oral history into ourselves and our lives and talking about where we are, the bad stuff that's happened, the good stuff that's happened, and how we can build on that to move forward. So the Race and Social Justice Initiative did not come out of the mind of Mayor Nichols. I mean, who could really think that? All right? All right? We got people of color out here working in community, trying to get things right. And sometimes these people get jobs. You know, here's the thing. Here's the thing. There's this whole notion that, like, Kelly, you're at the city. You're not community because you're with the city. And then we ask ourselves, well, who is community and what is community? And so for all those discussions, where we are at now, as I'm saying, we're building community here. Because I've been in community, and when I ain't working, if that's the qualification for being in community is I ain't got a job and I can't pay my bills, guys, that's not gonna work. We have to find new ways of defining the community that we are and how we're working together to fight for race, for racial equity, and for social justice. So part of what we're doing today is we're going over that history. We're gonna talk it out and let, actually, I have a third part to say. We're going to talk it out and let you all sort of like be part of this in some way. The third thing I want to say is we asked a lot of folks to be on this panel. And we ended up just having, I'm going to tell a whole honest story, all right? Like, you got to be honest, you got to be real, right? We ended up having 3 guys on the panel alone. When all the stuff I'd heard from Jump Getters, all these black and brown women were the ones who really pushed and created this race and social justice initiative. So we had to kind of encounter what that meant. And there are certain realities that brings to mind. I mean, we think about those most harmed by structural racism, and women of color working in the city, I hear so many horror stories around promotion, around opportunities to lead big projects. A lot of the stuff that actually the Women of Color in Leadership panel talked about yesterday. And so you gotta give folks grace if they're like, I'm not really sure I wanna be part of that panel as I'm working here, as I'm trying to survive. Because say if I don't have a job, then I'll just be right back in community, right? So we gotta think about stuff like that, all right? So that's the third part. So in the end, these gentlemen, and they'll all be introduced, these gentlemen agreed to be part of the panel, and then Kyana Wheeler, who is my deputy, are you my deputy manager? Is that the title?
I'm your boss.
Okay, that's my boss, there you go. There you go, this is my boss, yes. Exactly, and she decided to save the day. She decided to come on and join the panel. And then Brenda had been in our office for a long time. And the thing with Brenda Anibarro being here is I was sitting up in Steve's office. Steve, you guys know Steve Sneed from Seattle Center.
The mayor.
All right, so he's right here. I was sitting in Steve's office, and Steve said, we're sitting down talking about the summit, and Steve looks at me and says, funny, Brenda was doing what you were doing for many, 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 many years. So she would know a lot of things, and it was perfect. And we all love Brenda. So this is how this panel came together. We love all of you, but we got to figure some things out. And we also have to learn from history. And that's the first principle in the anti-racist principles, like learning from history. We're only going to be able to know how to address these issues that we're facing if we actually lift up the real history that's going on, interpret it, and internalize it. And so that's what we're going to try and do here. Thanks for being here. Welcome, panelists. I appreciate all of you.
So my role today is going to be moderating this incredible panel. I'm going to give a little bit of context in the questions I ask just to bring in some of the institutional history. But before we begin, I want to get a sense, and you guys might have done this yesterday, so I apologize, but just for all of us up here to have some context, how many people in the room have been with the city 20 years or more? If you could raise your hand. Oh, good amount. Okay. How about 10 years or more? And then 5 years, 5 to 10, okay. And so then how many in the last year? Okay, so really good spread. Wow, this is great. So we're gonna be talking about a lot of the history, like Kelly said, centering the community history and the people's history around RSJI, both within the institution, because I think there's some people's history in the institution that doesn't get lifted up, but then also for sure the community history. Before we begin, I wanna introduce the panelists, and then Michael's gonna lead us in a quick exercise. So I'm gonna go from my left down the row. So Chris Stearns, to my left is Navajo. He's a longtime community activist and advocate and attorney. He's served, I was telling Chris his bio is so long that I'm going to shorten it. He's served in many state level, federal and international posts. I think in terms of this conversation and some of the work with the city, he served as the chair of the Seattle Human Rights Commission for 2 terms, and in that work was really instrumental in a lot of the police reform efforts, and also worked really closely with community on passing the first ban the box legislation, so the first efforts around eliminating the use of criminal records, background checks in employment. So, and I was going to forgot to mention, stopped the anti-panhandling ordinance. If you guys remember that ordinance, the HRC was really instrumental in calling out the racial justice implications of that ordinance, and so tremendously grateful for his work on that commission. And then next to Chris, we have Larry Evans, who is also a longtime activist and advocate in our community. He's the legislative aide to Councilmember Larry Gossett. And so in addition to his deep community work, has also been a huge partner at the county in making sure that the county's equity and social justice initiative is off the ground and is actually about community. So we're really excited to have Larry here today. And then Kyana Wheeler, who I think many of you know, powerhouse at RSJI, also longtime city employee. And I think what I love about Kyana is she's been with the initiative since the beginning, working out in departments on the ground, and is now one of the, I think, part of the brain trust of the city. So excited to have Kyana on this panel. And Michael Davis is the Director of Environmental Justice and Service Equity Division at Seattle Public Utilities. And Michael, like the rest of the folks here, has been involved with the Race and Social Justice Initiative since the beginning, and in a department that has really transformed the way, the relationships it has with community. And I think one thing I'll just say that I love about Michael is that when RSJI hasn't always been clear about centering community, Michael and his team always have, and have always pushed us very lovingly to make sure that we're about community. So excited that he's going to be bringing his perspective to this panel.
I am so excited to be here with you all today. When I got the invitation to be on this panel, I was like, why me? You know, there's so many other people that can be here. You know, I've had the pleasure of working for the city of Seattle for over 30 years. This is my 31st year, and it has nothing been but a blessing, but it's also been a struggle, right? And one of the things I wanted to kick us off with is that, you know, I know that I would not be here if there weren't, if it wasn't for incredible, beautiful, loving sometimes kicking me in my ass black women. And so I want to use this opportunity for us to lift up the women in this work, particularly black women, and particularly for all of us, right? Brothers, sisters, we all need to stand by black women, stand by Native, Indigenous women, stand by women, and to support women and lift women up in this work, and to do the work with them. Ask them, you know, not just what are you doing, but ask them, how can I help, right? How can I help? So, you know, when this panel kicked off, I started, you know, trying to think about all of the women who've touched me and who've really have guided me in this work. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for really strong, not just really strong, but just women, black women, right? Because they are strong just because of who they are and what it is that they have to do in this world. So I'm gonna stop, and I'm gonna name off a couple of names. Shauna Crutchfield, who worked for Seattle Center, was someone who was really instrumental in this work. Paku Her, who worked for an organization called Crossroads, who came in and provided a good deal of learning, applied learning opportunities. One of the most powerful things that she shared with me, and one of the most powerful things that I heard, was that, you know, when you see racism, when racism shows up, do the opposite of what racism is really asking you to do. And that was really powerful, so I want to lift her up. Robert Diaz, who was also with Crossroads, was a really powerful woman. But again, I want to make sure that I'm lifting up my sister specifically, Ngozi Alero with King County Public Health, who's really the mother of King County's Equity and Social Justice Initiative. Marilyn Strickland with Mayor of City of Tacoma, who brought in City of Tacoma's Race and Social Justice Initiative, or Equity and Social Justice Initiative. And I think that's really important, you know, even though their work is new, you know, it happened because a black woman who was the mayor of Tacoma said, yes, we will. Afua Harris, Afua Njai, who's always been with me, who taught me everything that I know about West African culture, West African music, and a really incredible woman. Dr. Maxine Mims. Come on, y'all. Come on, y'all. Dr. Maxine Mims. We can't say enough about Dr. Mims for what she's done for our community and what she continues to do. Ben Knox, Christina Humbergs, who was with Seattle Public Utilities, was someone else who was really instrumental. But I'm gonna stop, but I wanted to get those names off my chest, and I also wanted to stir the water. I hope that you all are thinking about, you know, women in your lives, black women in particular, who you wanna lift up in this moment, who really brought this work into being. You know, this isn't city work, this is community work, right? This work came from the community. We didn't magically wake up one day and say, by God, we're gonna start a race and social justice initiative. Let's go, right? It was clamoring, it was organizing, it was, you know, breakfast, all sorts of opportunities. So I'd like to have folks sort of shout out. You can, you know, we can do it collectively, whatever, but shout out someone, shout out a woman's name, particularly a black woman, who's really touched you and who's honored you and who's really has helped to lift up this work. So I'm gonna put the mic down and let y'all go. Don't everybody go at once. Jermaine Covington.
There you go.
Mary Flowers. Dr. Earlene Butler.
I'd say Felicia Yearwood.
Paula Harris White.
Cheryl.
Patricia Young, Pat Wells. Debbie Barnes. Maxine Hayes, Dr. Maxine Hayes. Laquela Johnson. April Bowman. Darlene Flynn.
Cheryl Cobb.
Catlin Fullwood.
Tonight Brown. Ashay. Lauren Jones. Felicia Caldwell, thank you. Catherine Lester. Reagan Jackson. Natalie Hunter. Desiree Tabares.
Betty Lou Valentine and Jerry White.
Tamar Zier. I don't know if it's appropriate to lift up your fellow panelists, but I want to lift up Brenda, Anibarro, and Kyana. I also want to say thank you all. I'm sure that there's many other names, and the most important thing that we can do is to stand with those women, to support those women, to do what those women tell us what to do. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and jump into some questions. The panelists, like Kelly said, have tremendous expertise in history, and so excited to get that out. So we're going to start actually picking up on something that Kelly was talking about in his intro, which is that institutional stories often get told that center institutional power. And I want to put into the room that I think at times there's strategic reasons for that. So I think, you know, the story about Mayor Greg Nichols and the work he did on his campaign, or the kind of coming to light moment that he had on the campaign trail and seeing two Seattles and saying, I really need to put an initiative into play. There's some strategy that was behind lifting that up to push for political will, but there's a community cost that happens when we center those stories. And so really wanted to talk about and lift up what were the community stories or the community struggles that were happening alongside that. So perhaps Mayor Greg Nichols did have this epiphany, and don't want to take away from his moment. But there, like Michael was saying, there is tremendous history, tremendous organizing that actually pushed for an initiative to happen. It wouldn't have happened without that organizing on the ground, both in the institution. I know Vin Knox's name has been mentioned. She was really instrumental in making sure training was happening, as was Mary Flowers at HSD, but also in the community. And we were talking a little bit before the panel, and I recall before I started at the city, there were sit-ins happening by YUIR, Youth Undoing Institutional Racism, young folks in Mayor Greg Nichols' office daily. And so really wanting to bring in some of that history, and we didn't talk about order, so I think anyone who wants to jump in, but just really share with folks what were some of the instrumental moments or community struggles that you were a part of or that you were connected to or aware of that really led to the birth of the initiative as a whole, kind of formally in the city.
You know, as Kelly said earlier, this work only became incorporated with the city of Seattle with RSJI. It's been taking place for centuries. In my lifetime with the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panther Party here in Seattle. But to give a little bit of context, I was working for the City of Seattle's Department of Neighborhoods I started in 2000. And in March of 2001, Mardi Gras celebration down in Pioneer Square on Fat Tuesday, there was a riot basically. There were a group of young brothers that they say came from South King County, and some issues started. A young man, Christopher Kime, was killed. Paul Schell was the mayor at the time. I don't know if you remember, but there was some controversy around the Seattle Police Department, what they did or what they didn't do. And that became a campaign issue where, as Mayor Nichols was running against Mayor Schell. And at first, to be honest, at first what the mayor did was he vilified those young brothers, as is tradition in this country. But people like Mary Flowers, Vin Knox, Jermaine Covington, because of bringing UIR and laying some of that foundation in city government, they said, oh, no, you don't do that. So it did become an official campaign issue. It was one of 4 initiatives that Mayor Nichols ran on. And so when he won the election, a group of folks, primarily from the Department of Neighborhoods, I was one of them, others, Darlene Flynn, Glenn Harris, there were probably about a dozen folks, came up with the Race and Social Justice Initiative. So not only honoring Vin Knox, Mary Flowers, Jermaine Covington, and probably thousands of sisters and brothers that interrupted the traditional paradigm that the city government was headed towards in terms of vilifying those young men without glorifying the loss of life. Those young men were crying out in pain. They were suffering from trauma. They expressed that trauma. It played on the local media for weeks. I was working with what we call the Department of Neighborhoods Citizen Service Bureau. Now it's called the Customer Service Bureau. And we were fielding calls from the mayor's office. And I used to request mental health days because of the kind of calls that were coming in to the mayor's office. There were ideas, straight-faced, not based on anger and emotion. People thought they were coming up with real logical ideas in terms of setting a curfew for African-American males for major events like Torchlight Parade, Mardi Gras, things like that. And it wasn't surprising, but it was traumatic to hear that. So anyway, the Race and Social Justice Initiative became incorporated with the city of Seattle in early 2002 after the mayor won election. And just an interesting note, the morning after that Fat Tuesday situation in Pioneer Square, the following Wednesday there was a press conference at the mayor's office where Mayor Schell, and the press was, there was all this controversy around Chief Kerlikowske holding the police back and things like that. At the moment that press conference was about to start, there was an earthquake. And so I remember Chief Bailey taking Mayor Schell and escorting him out to the city's emergency service center to coordinate emergency services during that earthquake. And I can't help but to think that someone in that conference room looked above and said thank you for that earthquake, so that it gave them some time to kind of unpack what happened the night before. But again, RSJI, I think Vin Knox caught hell for bringing UIR to the city of Seattle probably about 10, 12 years before. That laid the foundation. Without that, I don't know if there would have been an RSJI.
I joined the Human Rights Commission probably in early 2009. I should note that I was recruited. Someone asked me how I got on there, and I was like struggling. And then I remembered, of course, I was recruited by my soon-to-be wife, Pamela Masterman Stearns. And if you don't know her, she's amazing. She's Tlingit, full-blooded Tlingit. And when she was at the city, she set up the Canoes, the Native American organization there, and now she's over at the county, and she set up the King County Native American Leadership Council. And Kelly mentioned, all kinds of retaliation at work, loss of promotions, things like that. She's been through it all, and so I really just have the utmost respect. But she's the one who put me in contact with SOCR and Mayor Nichols' office. And one of the first things that I was able to do, it was just really amazing, was someone recommended that I take the People's Institute on doing institutional racism course, and it was that one was a 2-day course, and it was just absolutely amazing. I got to convince some of my other commissioners that they should do the same thing, but it was incredibly eye-opening, incredibly enlightening to see what was going on and how really it was community-led. So it had profound experience on me and the other commissioners on the Human Rights Commission on how we went about our business and how we could better serve our people and our community.
I remember in around 2001, 2002, I had an opportunity to go to a People's Institute workshop at the Freedom Church. How many of y'all remember the Freedom Church? It's still around. I shouldn't say, do you remember the Freedom Church? It still is a Freedom Church. And it was one of those life-changing events, right? And I remember sitting in this workshop and hearing things that I knew, but but that had not been shared in all in one setting. And, you know, things really clicked for me. And it wasn't just me that was at that workshop. There were a number of other city employees. I was not there as a city employee, but there were other city employees. And I remember afterwards, you know, we got together and we talked about our experience at that workshop, and we talked about what needed to happen. And, you know, that wasn't necessarily the beginning of my journey, but that was a really pivotal point for me in terms of thinking about this being part of my job, not just part of my job, but it was my job. You know, it was my job. It really gave a new meaning to the word public servant, right? And I know that that has lots of triggers, right? Particularly use of the word servant, but I know that I'm here to serve my community, and the initiative really created the foundation for that. You know, we've already lifted up names of some really, really important people, and I want to lift up the name of someone who was really, really important to me. Her name was Tashong Diongson. Some of you know Tashong. She passed away a couple of years ago, and I'm going to try and not get too emotional, so Tasha, I will not look at you right now. But, you know, one of the most important things that she did for me was that she made a place at the table for me, right? When there was no place at the table. I would walk into rooms, meetings, and folks would ask me to make them some coffee. They'd ask me to help move the tables around, and Tashong would give them that look. And I don't have to say, you can imagine what that look would be. And they would step aside, right? And she created a place for me to be. And I lift that up because I would not be here, right? For this really incredible woman and for these really incredible women who've always made a place for me at the table and given space for me to, to really, you know, step into my power. I had no idea who I was at the time. I was a young man, a young dad, really had no idea and interest in really working for city government. So I know that this is a little bit off track on the question, but, you know, I just come back to the fact that, you know, it was folks like Tashong Diongson. It was, you know, really the organizing that was happening in community, particularly, you know, with folks at the Freedom Church and all the organizing that was happening through there, the village, et cetera. All of those things have been really, really instrumental in terms of where we've landed in city government.
So, I also want to just name a little bit of context. I have a uncle who is from the South, and he usually says, talk to me long distance. And what he's saying is like, give me that high view, give me that large scope. And one of the things when we talk about the institution naming the initiative as part of its history and what gets lost in the community, part of that is also the institution acts as if they made this proclamation and then it happened, right? So when I say talk to me long distance, I just want to give you some large scale scope. If you look at People's Institute website, it said that they came to the city of Seattle, it said that they came to Seattle as a community, early 90s, like 92, 93, or something to that effect. Talk to me long distance, I was a freshman in high school, okay? So when the initiative actually was born, I had just graduated college. And so when we talk about talk to me long distance, that is years of organizing that it took to get this to the city. And one of the things that gets lost is the amount of years it took to get there was a lot of people's sweat, blood, and tears, and a lot of people who died nameless, a lot of people who moved on nameless, a lot of people who did the work but don't actually get the credit, and that the city takes that credit. When I got to the city, it was about 2001. And there was a lot of things going on I went to UW, and one of the conversations, my undergrad was American Ethnic Studies, and it had just been pushed for years before that to get ethnic studies as a degree, right? It was a class you could take, but it was not something you could master, right? And so I was one of the first, of the 4 years who graduated with an ethnic studies degree. And UW was looking at what does it mean for it to be predominantly white teachers in the school district, in Seattle School District, and what are they churning out? Like, what is the stuff that they're churning out? And just to lift up another name, Ina Howell from Seattle Alliance for Black School Educators was an educator for over 30 years at the Seattle Public Schools, and she was instrumental in part of that push. And so when I say talk to me long distance, part of that conversation is that there were other conversations being had. Things didn't happen in silo. There was no like mono, one linear line to this, to race and social justice being implemented into the city. So naming that. And then in 2001, do you all remember what happened 9/11, 2001?
No.
And 9/11, 2001, it was my first year at the city, and when the institution says that it started something, one of the things that the institution gets to do is decide which part of it they want to do, right? It's the community that holds them accountable and says, you don't actually get to do it that way. And what also happens when the institution says that this is the work that we're going to take on is that the institution becomes the barometer of if they're doing the work well. So one of the things that the city did was decide which race was going to be necessary to address, while at the same time being horrible about immigrant communities after 9/11. And so we have to talk about like the full context of things and how things came to fruition through multiple means. And so when I say talk to me long distance, it's that big picture, right? The city of Bellevue, actually, if you look at People's Institute website, says that they got here to Seattle in around 92, and it says the city of Bellevue brought them. And what's interesting to me about that is that the city institutions get to start conversations and then stop them when they get hard. Right? And if we don't talk about how the conversation was trying to take place in multiple ways in the city, and that this is one thing that stuck, then we're actually missing the full picture of the conversation. And so I just want to note that it was happening multiple ways. It started way before I actually even got here. When I think about the magnitude of what had to take place from the time somebody's coming out of middle school, going into high school, to get to a place where somebody's coming out of college and then can participate, that's a lot of effort. It's a lot of movement, and that's a lot of work that actually got it to a place where then it was written into paper and codified into an ordinance.
So you guys have touched on some of the early years. I'm going to bring in, so the first few years, and I think many of you know this history, the initiative, the RSJI in the city, and I won't be able to speak to the county, but Larry, it would be great to get your perspective on this. We were really focused on bringing our house in order. You guys probably remember that. We talked a lot about that. We said we need shared definitions. We need to roll out sort of uniform training. RPOI, Race, Power, and Illusion, was spread to all departments. That's when change teams were created. Core team was created. I think to give some love, Mickey Fern, Jermaine Covington, Darlene Flynn, all were incredible at really looking at a large institution and saying, how do we move an institution, and looking at from the inside. And that was really where their expertise was. Darlene brought in some work focused on the tipping point theory of change. What's the percentage of people that we actually need to get on board to create a movement internally? Then Glenn Harris, Julie Nelson, Jackie Lorenzar, all were really instrumental in saying, okay, we've gotten this initiative to a certain point. How do we actually say we're going to make an impact so that the disparities that we see in the community are actually impacted? And so things like the RSJI Community Roundtable was formed. The work plans that we now have in departments, that structure was developed. So there was a lot of the structural pieces that got put into place in those years. And so, and at the same time, I'll also lift up, I know that a number of you were involved in raising up the Equitable Development Initiative, which now is a lot stronger and actually has financial resources, but early in the day really was trying to partner with all the community groups doing anti-displacement work throughout the city, and this is like 2010, 2009, to a point where now we actually have resources, and I know UBA is leading a lot of that work. So would love to hear from you all. I think from me, so I left the city 4 months ago, and have been having this, when you leave somewhere and you actually have room to lift your head up and think, because in this, I think all of you know how busy you all are, you never have that moment to reflect. To me, there was this tremendous, wow, here's so many things that I've learned, things that I would have done differently in hindsight. And so would love for us to have that conversation about what did we gain as an institution in those early years, and not the super early years. I'm talking all the way up to like 2014, 2015, because we'll move into like the next level after that. What were things that were really important that happened? Because I'm not trying to discount. I think there was some amazing work that needed to happen that did happen. And then what are the things that we did learn? Because I think it is important to look back and say, we might have done that differently. Some nuances that I know King County, and I remember us having this conversation internally at the city, is you all started your initiative from a different place. We said, let's get our own house in order. If I recall, the county said, let's go out to community and hear what community wants. And it was a different strategy. And I think it might have led to different results. It arguably may not have. But would love to hear some of your insights, both of the things that we gained that were beautiful that happened, and then things that are lessons.
I think that one of the beautiful things about the early years in the initiative is that it had never been done before. So there was no blueprint. There was no direction on what the work is and what we should be doing. One of the things that was very clear is that we knew as a city our practices were centered in white supremacist values, right? And when I say that word, what I mean is that whiteness as a supreme. I told you my undergrad was in literature, ethnic studies, and I always say that the thesaurus is my favorite word, is my favorite tool. And so when I say like supremacist, if you put that in your thesaurus, the other word is you're going to get is governance, right? And so we had a white governance, and it was centered in what that meant around who had access, who had where we put our finances, who we funded, what economic development happened in what community, when communities pushed back, which communities' voices did we value and which ones we didn't, right? And what we centered that in, the city of Seattle centered that in, was folks who had the currency of whiteness and what that mobility meant, but also the actual currency, right? And that was tied to race. And so we had an awareness of how we moved, but what we didn't have a full awareness of was our continued complicitness. And so I say that to say that we knew that we needed to get our own house in order, and what that looked like is that we needed to do large-scale training so that everybody understood what it meant to talk about race from a personal and institutional and a structural perspective. We knew that we needed to separate those out because their solutions are different. When we're talking about interpersonal racism, the solutions are different than when we're talking about structural racism. And if we can't name that, then we actually don't know what solutions we're moving towards. I remember the early years when I first took the trainings. It was like a 4-day training. It was People's Institute, but it was also like Crossroads Ministry, Western State. We were trying to take in all the information because there was no blueprint, and we were trying to figure out how do you do this institutionally, because what happens in the community, it's while it is context for what happens in the institution is very grounded in the ways in which it does its work, right? It's not going to upend its work because there's data and research that supports why we do it in this way, although we do hemorrhage money in ways that we'd never look at and are accountable for, and we should really focus on what that looks like on the community. But we knew that we needed to look inside at ourselves. We spent a good amount of years developing infrastructure, and I mean that by developing the ways that the initiative was going to function, so developing change teams, developing things like, the RSJI team. Do you know that we're a team of, what are we now, 8? We're a team of 8, and that's the biggest it's ever been. It's the biggest it's ever been. When Darlene was pulled to sort of lead the charge in the initiative, it was a team of 2, her and Jackie, and then they participated with the policy team that Brenda and other early folks like Elliot were a part of. But can you imagine what it took to actually build infrastructure into a city with 2 people doing the driving work? I remember Darlene was my mentor, and I remember when I first got started, there was lots of, I can't do this, and what do you mean you want me to talk in front of, council? Like, I can't do this. And Darlene spent time with me pouring into me, and I spent time in her office. Reagan and I joke a lot about her office was like, you know, our sanctuary, because it hurt everywhere else, but it didn't hurt there. And I can't imagine what it took for one person to do that work, to do the work that 8 people do right now. Like, if you could imagine what it took to do what 8 people do right now, because she did all of it. She did all of the training for the city. She did a lot of the leadership development. She did a lot of the crying with people when it was too hard. She did all of that. And so when we talk about getting our house in order, it was a labor of love. It was a lot of sweat and agony and pain, but it built the infrastructure that it had in order for it necessary to move forward. It was about 2011 where the next 3-year strategic plan was going to be 2012 to 2015, and that plan was moving into community. And so prior to that, it was also not only getting our house in order of what we needed to know, but it was getting our house in order about how do you actually be in community. There was no blueprint for what it looked like for the institution to not continue to cause harm when they went out to communities of color. There was no blueprint, and even over the strategic plan, that 3-year strategic plan, we learned a lot about how much harm we were causing. We're still, in 2018, learning a lot about how much harm we cause when we connect with the community. And so I keep saying that there was no blueprint, because when I go places and people are like, oh, you're with the City of Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative, the first thing I say is learn from our mistakes. Because you can actually be in 5 years where it took us 15 years to get. You can actually be further if you pay attention to how we fell down and how we got back up. You can be a lot further if you understood how we misunderstood what the work was, how we continued to push on structural and institutional impacts, but didn't do the heart space of what it feels like to be in an institution that's harmful. You can learn a lot. And so I know that King County started in a different place because there's already learning that folks were doing, whether that was community, whether that was across the country, or whether that was in our own backyard at the city. But there was a lot of big lift. I know a number of people who tend to not be as old in the city that say, you know, RSJI isn't doing anything. I was there and I watched Darlene's blood, sweat, and tears pour into creating an infrastructure. I watched Glenn go around the country and try to help folks understand why this is what cities need to be doing. There's a lot that's been done. That infrastructure, the core teams, the change teams, the RSJI subcaps, those things didn't exist. Not only getting them off the ground, but convincing people to fund them was a big lift. And so there has been lots of work. It might not have solved racism, and it won't, but it might not have solved racism yet, but there's a lot of work that has been done, and a lot of those people, the harm that came from doing that work day after day, a lot of those people are no longer here because of how the institution functions, because they got pushed out, because there was no movement, mobility upwards, because the city can't see the blood, sweat, and tears and the emotional labor of folks. But there's been work. There's been a big lift that took place at the beginning, and I think what that's done is allowed for us to now be philosophical about what does it look like.
No, I mean, I think that, so I'll talk about, you know, some of the things, some of my takeaways, and sort of, you know, I think Kyana did an excellent job talking about, you know, the history and particularly the work that Darlene and, you know, we just want to say Jackie Lorenzar's name again, because she was just an amazing woman. You know, she brought a lot of spirit into some of the early work that we were doing in the initiative. But, you know, some of you have heard me use the word played a lot lately. And, you know, there's a way in which the initiative gave us all a lot of hope, right? It really taught us things and confirmed things for us that some of us already knew, and for some of us it was like, whoa, I didn't know that. And it really, it got us excited, but the institution was not, and I would say still isn't ready for us, right? And, you know, that's one of the things that I would say has been the biggest challenge, has been the thing that's been the most disappointing, right? That we can do all of this really great work, right? That we can be so forward-thinking, that we can know the answers, right? And we're still having to do those same dances, right? We're still getting played. And worse yet, it's not just that, you know, we collectively are getting played, but we're being played against each other, right? And, you know, that's, for me, I don't have any answers. I've been in the middle of that more times than I care to really offer, and I'm definitely on a learning and a healing journey as relates to how do you survive this institution? How do you not lose yourself? How do I not lose my blackness, right? How do I not forget where I come from, right? How do I not be beholden to that paycheck? And how do I deal with folks who will look at me in the face and smile and say, tell me more about that, right? Which for me is like, just get the hell out of the way, you know? I don't have time to explain to you what I know to be true, but the reality is that we work in a bureaucracy. We work with folks whose hearts, you know, they want to be that person, but they're so caught up in their brain or caught up in their ego or whatever it is that it's really difficult to make the change. So for me, as much as it's been one of my biggest takeaways from the early years is that, you know, we have got to come together, particularly as, you know, departments are hiring staff, racial equity advisors, and creating teams. You know, we never really talked about what does that mean in relationship to our change teams, right? And for some of us, we're struggling, right? For some of us, you know, the institution set us up, right? So you had paid staff, right? And their job was to really move racial equity forward. And you had a change team that, you know, when it came in, it was marginalized, right? When it came in, it was questioned. When it came in, they were told, you don't have time to do this. And then all of a sudden, you have these folks that come in, and it's their job. And they're being told that they need to lead this work, that they need to do this work. And we don't talk, right? We don't make sure that we have a shared, you know, narrative, that we have a shared strategy around how this works, how this work needs to move forward together. So, you know, my biggest lessons learned is that we've got to come together, right? We have got to not allow ourselves to get played, right? That we are, and I firmly believe that, you know, if the people lead, the leaders will follow. And, you know, some of the work that I've seen happening here recently, particularly around harassment, right? That wasn't leadership sort of standing up and saying, let's do the right thing, right? It was employees, it was women specifically who said, hell no, right? And I think that we have a responsibility to ourselves. We have a responsibility to the institutions that we work in. We have a responsibility for the people who pay our salaries, right? To do the right thing. And, you know, I'm not telling folks to go in and like bust down the director's door and say, damn it, we're gonna do the right thing. But if that's what it takes, you know, just make sure you got some allies around you, right? Make sure that you don't just go and kick in that door. Make sure that you, and if you need to do that, you know, I mean, passion is like, you know, so passion sometimes can be the best leader, but I can't really speak enough about when we you know, when McGinn came in, I'm gonna go ahead and name some names, right? When McGinn came in, and then we had Murray, you know, we never really fully embraced that we were leading with race, right? We still don't fully embrace that we are leading with race. We still don't understand why we lead with race, right? And we've got to understand that. We have to be able to know our why, right? We have to be able to tell our peers the why. So I can go on, but I'm going to stop and turn it over to my fellow panelists. But I just want to say that, this is a really, really, it's all been pivotal. It's all been really important. But we are really in an important time. And if there's ever an opportunity and a need for us to come together collectively and really think about how we move this work forward, now is the time. Thank you.
I think one of the gains, early gains, I recall the first People's Institute training, UIR training, I think it was in 1991 that I attended. And, I tear up pretty easy, but I think most of the people in that training, it was a 2-day training, were in tears throughout it. Because I don't know how many of you can relate to this. I'm older, so I grew up at a time when if there was a black person on TV, my siblings, we all came running to see. I mean, just to be recognized. Now, the way we were portrayed was a different issue, but one of the things that the UIR training did for us, those of us of color that were in attendance, was like, wow, our trauma is being talked about for the first time in a public setting. And so jumping forward to about 10 years when RSJI took place, it was in city government. The same trauma, the same issues that we deal with on a daily basis, they're inherently a part of our life. This institution is daring to talk about it. I'll jump forward a little bit. In 2007, Ron Sims gave a speech at the Urban League breakfast, and based on the Dellums Commission, the study that was done, he said that King County was going to undergo equity and social justice initiative at that time. It was largely based on the City of Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative, and it was different elements to it. The way that we provided services as King County government, the way we hired, and the community engagement piece. So normalizing race, normalizing white privilege, normalizing internalized racism, there were folks, a lot of folks that didn't even realize that biologically there's no difference in terms of race, that race was intentionally created as a social construct to maintain white supremacy. That was eye-opening, and here in 2018, I know I still work with some folks that still can't believe that. So, I mean, normalizing that conversation is different than us internalizing it and doing our individual and collective work on it. One of the things that we've learned and that we continue to struggle with is the community engagement piece. I think those of us that do this work, we have to guard ourselves against what term, being kind of cliquish. You know, we're doing this work, whether we're paid to do it, whether we're doing it on a voluntary basis. What I do a volunteer group, a men's support group down at the youth detention facility, and those young brothers down there have no idea what RSJI or ESJ means, and that's on us because I will say I'm making money off of their backs. And if I'm not doing everything in my power to empower them, not to increase King County's budget around ESJ, but to empower those communities so that they can do the work more effectively than we'll ever be able to do the work, that's something that we continue to struggle with. I know my job description is a legislative aide, and this speaks to institutional racism. If I do it the way they write it, it's guaranteed to support white supremacy and to do harm to my community. So I have to look at that job description, and as we all do, and figure out, okay, how am I going to interject elements that I need to interject in this so that not only I do no harm, but do benefit to my community. And you know, the other thing that we struggle with is we're going through this budget process in King County right now, and we talk a lot about diversity and hiring. there's visual diversity, but there's also philosophical diversity. And if there's not room in that institution to accept different perspectives, to accept the cultural expertise, because, sorry, no offense, but you don't get that at the University of Washington. You get little bits and pieces of it, but the real cultural expertise is not identified as a best practice. It is not measurable because the institutions don't recognize it, but it lies in those communities. Now, if there's room within our different departments and institutions to truly be diverse and to, I mean, one of the things we struggle with is that we fund a lot of programs now, and this really started with Best Start for Kids 3 years ago. We made a concerted effort to fund organizations that are significantly different than the organizations that King County has funded in the past. Some of those organizations that we fund to work with marginalized populations, those individuals, because of our policies, they can't even get into the institutions to work with those brothers and sisters that are confined in the institutions. That's the epitome of institutional racism right there. And if we can't change that, we're not doing effective work. As Kyana said, what happens to brothers and sisters that do somehow slip through the side door into those institutions and try to do that work effectively is the institution chews them up and spits them out and does additional trauma not only to them as individuals but to the community at large. So I think moving forward, one of the things that is really important is that we do this community engagement piece at a much deeper level. And the only way that that can be done is to have the community, when folks from the community are part of the institution and their expertise is recognized, you have internal change that takes place. It takes place very slowly, but it does take place. And those that are in power have to make sure that they recognize that cultural expertise or that racial expertise. One of the things, again, that we struggle with is ESJ is looked at as this side issue that we are supposed to spend time doing, but only at lunchtime, only during your breaks. If it's not interwoven as a core piece of what we do, just the same way that fiscal management is, or or customer service is, or financial responsibility, if looking at what we do through an equity and racial lens is not a core piece of what we do, then it's not going to be as effective as it should be. And that's the biggest challenge that we have as King County government in our ESJ efforts. And lastly, I just mentioned an example, Ngozi Oleru. She, many of you may not be familiar with her, but she was the director of environmental health. She changed her department, her section of public health looks significantly different than most sections of King County government do. She's no longer the director of public health. That just happened within the last year. So we've got a long way to go. I know that the trauma that those young brothers that I look in the eyes of every Sunday afternoon from 1 to 2:30, they have a lot to teach me. If I go in there thinking that I have all of these things to teach them, I'm missing the mark. They're going through trauma as young men in 2018 that was significantly different than when I was their age, and I won't say when. So I challenge all of us to continue to do our work, to be outspoken, because some of us, we have to be outspoken every day. If we're not, it's difficult to look in the mirror in the evening. I'd rather look in the mirror and risk loss than be comfortable and gain a salary and convince myself that I'm doing really effective work.
There are two things that kind of struck me as I was listening. One is that, in the city and the county and other institutions, I'll just speak for Native Americans, if I can try to do that. I'm trying to be humble about this. is that we don't really see ourselves reflected in the workforce. And so I spent 15 years in Washington, D.C., 5 of which were as a committee counsel in the House, and 3 of which were a director at the Energy Department. So those are workforces with like almost 10,000 in the House, and we had a little bit over 13,000 in the Energy Department. And I think if I can, I'm just going to guesstimate, but maybe I could think of like 25 Native Americans in the House and like about maybe 30 in the Energy Department, and that was spread all over the United States. It was just crazy how very little representation there was. So when I moved to Seattle in 2005, I was actually just, it was just really wonderful to be surrounded by Native culture, which is kind of cool. But I was really impressed, by, what had started to happen in the city. And I met my wife when she was, I think she was on like core team 2 or something like that. You might know, but it was really impressive what they were doing, what was happening in the city. And sometimes, your perspective from being in the government is it's kind of hard to see what other people think of you. But I remember in 2009, I went to a national conference where the Human Rights Commission was here, so I didn't have to travel too far. It was NACOL, the National Association of like Community Oversight of Law Enforcement. And so, everyone at NACOL, they were just like totally amazed at what Seattle was doing on police and on policing and trying to make that institution more responsive to the people they serve, and in particular more responsive and less brutal to people of color. And I'm not sure that people from the city really had that perspective of what outsiders from Hawaii, outsiders from Louisiana, New Jersey, Boston, Minneapolis thought of Seattle. But they were just incredibly impressed by what people who worked for the city were doing. And so, that is really important to know, that you may feel kind of rough, kind of crappy some days. Yeah, there are definitely moments when you don't feel great about yourself, but you are so appreciated, and there are people outside who would love to be part of something similar, and you have such power, and I'm just so grateful that you're here working for the city.
One thing, and I want to give some love to Natalie Hunter, wherever you are, Natalie. Thank you, Natalie. So Natalie raised wanting to make sure we're also bringing Mickey Fern's name into the room, and so definitely want to do that. For those of you who don't know Mickey, he was the first person that was hired to head up officially the Race and Social Justice Initiative, and was very much responsible for making sure. He actually moved it from it being situated in Mayor Nichols' office to being situated in the Civil Rights Office under Jermaine Covington. And as somebody, I think for any of us that know him, was able to hold both big picture, long-term strategy and heart. So he would make space to have you sit in his office and talk to you for hours, even though he was in the middle of 1,000 other things. And that's, I know people who I've worked with, where I'm not good at holding that space of making sure somebody comes in and you can stop everything. He always did that beautifully. And so Natalie, thanks for making sure we're recognizing his name in all of this and his work. Before we jump back into the questions, we are going to leave time for your questions, so I'm going to let you know that. But I also want to stop because I think there was, during the break, some folks brought up a question about when panelists were talking about how the initiative RSJI really leads with race and centers anti-racism work. And so want to actually spend a minute talking about that, because if folks aren't familiar with the why, that's such a fundamental piece of the work that the initiative's doing. And so I want to just create some space for that. And not going to pick on anyone, but I am going to kind of look at Kyana, if you're up for it.
Yeah, I can definitely start that conversation, and then I'm looking at Michael to help finish that up. There's a number of reasons why we start with race, and as part of the initiative, what we also do is we practice naming all the reasons why. I'm going to name one of the reasons. I actually want to name two things. One, when we look at all of the social ills that our society is dealing with, when we look at the statistics of who is not finishing school, when we look at the number of people who are unhoused and experiencing homelessness, when we look at people, when we look at statistics around poverty, when we look at statistics around harm caused to our trans and LGBT communities, when we look at all of these statistics, it is the people of color in every single one of those categories who are harmed the worst. I'm going to say it one more time. When you look at statistics, regardless of what they are, it is the people of color within those categories that are harmed the worst. And if we can't name and address folks most harmed, then we actually can't name and address any of our issues. I want to also name a conversation about intersectionality. Who's heard about intersectionality lately? When we talk about look at me long distance, Kimberly Crenshaw coined intersectionality like way back, late 80s, early 90s. Intersectionality talks about all of our identities and the way they intersect. And when we talk about most harm, we take those identities and we intersect them with most harm. Intersectionality is the compounding of marginalization. I'm trying to figure out how much definition giving I'm doing. So the way that our systems are set up is that there's dominant, in every single one of our identities, there are dominant identities, right? So when we talk about race, a dominant identity is white. The marginalized identity is people of color. When we talk about ability, the dominant identity is people with mental and physical ability. When we talk about marginalized folks, it is folks who have disabilities or experiencing mental disabilities. When we talk about, thinking of another intersection, when we talk about religion, it is folks who the dominant religion in our society is Christianity in all its forms, and then the marginalized identity is folks who are atheist or have other beautiful spiritualities. So do you get what I'm saying when you talk about there's a dominant identity and there's a marginalized identity, right? We're so afraid to talk about race that we will absolutely talk about the marginalized identities, folks who are experiencing disabilities, folks who are in poverty, folks who are in LGBTQ communities, but we won't intersect that with race. We take race off the table regularly because it is uncomfortable. I come from a mixed family. My father is white by race, Italian by ethnicity. I'm giving you a definition there. If you're talking about ethnicity, you're talking about where your people were from a long time ago. If you're talking about race, though, we're talking about the political construct of this country, okay? So when, I have to even say that because we're so afraid to say race. I have to say that because we're so afraid to say race. When people are like, want to ask what race you are, people say things like, well, what's your nationality? In this country, if you're a citizen in this country, that's American. Like, your nationality is not your race, right? And we have to get clear about those definitions because we're so afraid to say race that we say other things. So that's one of the reasons we're so afraid to say it. But when I was saying that my father is Italian by ethnicity and he's white by race, and my mother is black, and you recognize I only said one of those things because that's how race works, right? So my mother's black. In my household, we didn't talk about race. We talked about culture. We talked about personal ability. We talked about all these things because race is such a scary conversation. So in a mixed household where we're experiencing differently how race functions, we still couldn't talk about race. And so another reason why we talk about that is when we talk about intersectionality, we are talking about race, right? If you want to talk about your identities and name them, and you want to say, I'm just giving an example, that you are, white, cis male, educated, those are not intersections. Those are standards, those are norms, those are what society has held up as the norm. Those are not intersections, right? When you start talking about marginalization, those are intersections. So if you are, give you another example. If you are white, female, cis female, and LGBT or lesbian, the intersections are lesbian and female, right? Because white is a standard, that's a norm. The other two are intersections, which means somebody's more harmed than you are, a person of color with those. So we've got to be able to talk about race, and nobody wants to talk about race. They're like, you know, I'm intersectional. Can we talk about who's more harmed than you? I have a few privileges, which means somebody's more harmed than I am, right? English is my first language. I am US born. Somebody is more harmed than I am. And if we can't talk about the intersecting identities, the intersectionality as compounded harm, and you want to talk about, as a person who identifies as white, that you're intersectional, talk about race. That makes you intersectional. If you can't actually talk about race, you aren't intersectional. And I don't want to hear, let's talk about intersectionality, if you actually can't talk about the full gamut of what intersectionality is. It is the compounding of that marginalization. Can you tell I have a little bit of feelings about these things? And so I just want to name those two. People of color are most harmed in all of our statistics. And we're so scared of race that we actually want to talk about other things like culture, intersectionality, or ethnicity.
One of the best examples that's been shared with me around why we lead with a racial equity lens is that, you know, if we look at something like the issues that women deal with, that you're going to see a laundry list of things that are going to be common across the board for all women, right? But that when you put color on top of that, when you put race on top of that, there is another list that's, you know, that's developed. And so by leading with a racial equity lens, you know, we believe that, you know, if you center race in your conversation, if you center race in your analysis, if you center race in your work, you will not only address issues that affect women of color, but as a result, you will benefit all women, right? And it's really important because I think that we lose sight of that. And you know, it's as simple as that, right? But that by centering race, we all benefit, right? White folks benefit, white women benefit, white men benefit, right? But if we lose sight of that and we're trying to figure out, you know, how do we center disability in that, you know, that's important. But it's really important for us to make sure that we don't forget that this is a really fundamental strategy around how we're going to really achieve liberation. We're going to achieve it because we center race in our work, right? And it's one of those things that, you know, it's really simple. It doesn't need to be overly complicated, but it's so easy for us to turn this into a debate, right? Or turn it into, and no, it can't. And you know, if there's anything that I hope that we all walk out of here today is really, if you don't have a commitment, a renewed commitment around why it is that we lead with race, and you know, we're more than happy to talk more with you about that. Kyana and other folks from SOCR can definitely talk about that. You know, I'm sure that most of you or some of you may have read about the recent abolishment of the death penalty here in Washington State, right? And one of the things I love about that story, right, is that, you know, race and racism was really how the research, how the analysis was done, right? And so not only was race centered in why it is that we shouldn't have a death penalty, because they found that, you know, the process was racist, right? It wasn't colorblind, you know? Men of color, women of color were being impacted differently, disproportionately, you know, as compared to the rest of the population. But, you know, when I picked up the newspaper and I was reading the article, you know, they showed a number of folks who had been on death row. And I want to say that there was as many, if not more, white men, you know, in that little photo op, right? And, you know, I was like, wow. You know, if there's ever an example, and, you know, I'm like, if I have an opportunity to use this as a training tool, if I have an opportunity to use this to help make my point, right, to make our point about how we all benefit, right? And yeah, some people are against the death penalty, and, you know, I'll pray for them. But you know, it really is, you know, for me, a really fundamental example as to, you know, why it is that we lead with a racial equity lens, because we all benefit. Thank you.
Ethel Evans, that's my mom. Talking about strong, powerful black women gave me the spirit to fight from an early age. Kyana mentioned that race wasn't talked about often in her home. Race was always talked about in my home. Of course, we lived in Montana for the first 8 years of my life, so it was a survival mechanism. But, you know, one of the things that I think the city's Race and Social Justice Initiative, the advantage it had over King County's Equity and Social Justice, is that, at least in title, race was put out there. Over the years, and I've been with King County for 12 years now, as I said earlier, the ESJ was created, or launched, I should say, within King County government in 2008. Introduced in 2007, launched in 2008, and we struggled with it. As Kyana said, we talked about health disparities, we talked about poverty rates, we talked about life expectancy, we talked about rates of suspension and expulsion among children, we talked about incarceration rates, we talked about homelessness, but there was such an exact correlation to race in all of those factors. Yet we tiptoed around race for years until many folks from the community and many folks within King County called it out and said, you know, let's not fake the funk. If we're going to have this discussion, we have to put the defining factor, something that was created by this country, yet this country is in denial in talking about the importance that it's been used as a tool to oppress people. So when you see today, King County, our equity and social justice, we talk about leading with race. And I give people like Matias, Valenzuela, Erica Cox, Paula Harris-White, Ngozi Oleru, and many others, Marlon Brown, credit for pushing us to that point, because we can't have a conversation about inequities in our society without putting race first and foremost in that conversation. There was one other thing that I was thinking about earlier in terms of how we do this work moving forward. And it's difficult. I'm just going to put it out here. As a black man, I have male privilege. And if I'm not advocating first and foremost on behalf of my sisters, who in many cases have suffered worse trauma than I could ever even imagine, then I'm not doing the work. I put two challenges out here. White women, you got to do the work. You got to do the work within yourselves, and you got to do the work within each other. Because in social services and education, you're coming in contact with little boys that look like me on a daily basis, and they're being chewed up and spit out. We've heard the national stories, for instance, the white woman who followed, or the black man was trying to get into his own building and she followed him, questioned what he was doing there. Or the white woman who challenged the sister that was in college studying and fell asleep and in each case, the police were called. Deep within your soul, you know that the system works on your behalf inherently in an unfair way. You've got to do that work. I hope I'm not offending anybody. White men, you know you've got to do that work. As a black man, Michael, John Page, Marlon, and I, we're doing our work. I met Chris years ago because I'm thinking if Native Americans continue to be treated as invisible and oppressed, then I could never truly be free either. So we've all got to do that work, and what you said about intersectionality, we've got to be against oppression, period. If we're not really doing this work as effective as we could be. We're playing into that trick bag that Michael was talking about earlier, where by design, we're all played against each other. So King County is finally leading with race. We're catching up to the city of Seattle, but a great deal of work has to be done. And you know, I work for an elected official, and I'm gonna call out the elephant in the room, the Children and Family Justice Center. It was, and I had a conversation with Bo during the break. Bo, you still here? There he is. Bo talked about the importance of something that he heard all of the panelists, all of us talk about, the importance of community. There's never been a movement in this country that's moved forward significantly if the community wasn't leading the effort, and we as government employees or people in the private sector didn't follow their lead. We don't lead, we follow them and support their movement, but they're the ones that provide the street heat, so to speak, in order to make things move. Working for an elected official, it's difficult. The dynamics of the King County Council are different than the Seattle City Council. Be honest, neither one is progressive as they would like to think that they are, but working for King County is much more challenging. We control, and I say that as an employee of King County, we control the criminal justice system, the Department of Adult and Juvenile Detention, the King County Jail, Superior Court, District Court, and to do that work, sometimes it requires being so covert that you don't even notice you're making progress. And one of the people in the audience that I've worked with in that regard, I don't know if I should call her out or not, but Mariko Lockhart, in terms of looking at the rate that our young people, especially African American and Native American young people, are being locked up as well as adults, and doing something about it, it was the community that gave us the power to make inroads in that effort. But that covert work that you have to do sometimes behind closed doors, and I probably shouldn't even be saying this, but it's how that work has to be done. As a black man, if I tie into my history here in this country and being familiar with white supremacy, I hate to say it, but sometimes I know what you all are going to do before the conscious thought comes into your mind, because there's nothing new under the sun. What I have to do sometimes is anticipate that and try to figure out how to navigate around what you're planning to do, and most importantly, as Bo said, be a conduit to the community so that the community is empowered to really move forward, because it's not gonna move forward. Neither RSJI or ESJ isn't gonna move forward at the rate we want to see it move forward if we don't empower the community to take control on it and push forward.
To me, it seems like one of the most defining moments in our city's history was the police shooting of John T. Williams, and and so race is just a huge factor there. I mean, a young white police officer who's not from around here, he just encountered an older Native artist, and the young officer just really didn't have any understanding of the culture, of the race, of the identity, why someone would be carrying around their tools, a knife, and wood, and yet that's that led to the death of John T. Williams, and that led to federal investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice. And so one of the things that came out of that, of course, was that the Justice Department did find there was unconstitutional policing through excessive use of force. But one of the most disappointing things to us was that in a city that is 70% white and 30% people of color, even though the Justice Department found that over 50% of the people who were targeted by the police were people of color, they still were not able to come to a conclusion that there was an unconstitutional pattern of discrimination. And that's just still out there. I hope that one of the days that the city does get to work with the police department and maybe SOCR and figure out actually how to set some baselines and measure the actual impact of policing on people of color. But to us, that always seemed like that was just a huge item left on the table, and it still remains unresolved today. So there's that, and then there's one final piece which, when you talk about race, we're living and breathing it. I mean, you're literally standing or sitting on it. And all this land was the home of the Duwamish people. Some are still here. They're still surviving against all odds. Others are not too far. They were forced away in a sort of a do-or-die predicament to move to the Muckleshoot, to move to the Tulalip or the Suquamish Indian reservations. But this whole thing is, it's like the city, the Space Needle. It's the result of the dominant culture, the dominant institution, their effect on indigenous people of this land. So, yeah, it's easy to forget, but really no matter where you go, you're on someone else's land.
And I just want to say one more thing. I was really, I loved how this morning George kept asking, are you all uncomfortable yet, right? And one of the things that Seattle's great at is making each other feel real good. And Larry had said, I hope I didn't offend anyone, and I hope he did, because what gets us to that place is our discomfort. If you are uncomfortable, it's actually your growing edge. It's actually where you're about to expand and become bigger than you are. Can I make you uncomfortable for a moment? In my trainings, when we do trainings and we do trainings around why we lead with race, one of the things that comes up often is, this woman and people of color space. And as a woman of color, I feel extremely like I have to pick a spot, right? Like I have to go to. And so I've been challenging folks to, when you're talking about women and people of color, if you could just talk about women of color. And let me make you uncomfortable for a second. For white women, is there anything that women of color cannot speak to that actually includes you? Women of color, or white women, you can speak to a lot of things, but not race. You don't have the experience. It will always be mental gymnastics for you. You can always only read about it, only imagine it, but you actually can't ever know it. And so when we're talking about women of color, they actually know everything you know, white women, and more. White men, is there anything that men of color can't speak to? They know what it's like to be a man. They also know what it's like to deal with race. White men, you actually know everything except race. Men of color, you know it all. And so one of the things that we have to get clear on is it is okay for women of color to represent. It is not just okay, it is imperative for women of color to represent white women. And it is imperative that white men understand that men of color need to represent you. When we look at media or advertisements and things like that, we're always asked, people of color are always asked to see themselves in the white people displayed in the advertisement, but white people are never asked to see themselves in the people of color displayed. I hope you're uncomfortable, because what you need to understand, it is women of color who represent women, and it is men of color who represent men. And when we're talking about trans and non-binary, it is still people of color that represent you. Are you uncomfortable?
Okay, well, I'm going to do one quick thing. So sorry, yeah, we do want to leave time for questions. I want to thank all the panelists for sharing so much. I want to have one moment for a quick, another quick thing. And Larry, you started to talk about this in your last remarks, but I think one thing that we've done, and I've been a part of many, many summits, I think all of them now, including this one, has been, we've talked a lot about the why. We haven't always gotten into what our strategy is. And so I just want to raise that because I really appreciate what Larry was saying about when community is pushing on the institution and where are those points. So budget, for example, and I know city is right now in the middle of budget, and I have a bit of freedom from no longer working in the city to say a little bit. And I want to just call that out, that there is such an important space, whether it happens in summits or in your own education as change teams or in core team or just as a department member to figure out where those leverage points are in the city, because it took me 12 years to really understand that, and I wish I had had it in year one. And so I'm going to call out the budget director, has tremendous power in the city, and the budget office as a whole. And Michael brought up City of Tacoma, Mayor Strickland, African-American woman who really pushed for the city to have an equity initiative. I was looking at their budget the other day, and they lead with equity, and then the budget is set up under that. We have pushed to try to have that happen here, and it has not happened at the city. And it doesn't mean that Tacoma's budget is perfect. It's not reflective necessarily, but it's a start. And so I think really challenging everybody here to say, how do we get smarter about our institution, and where since you're inside of it, wherever you're at, there's so much power that each of you hold. And so I just think that's an important piece and a learning. And the other one that I want to say is that we didn't talk a lot, which I think is probably good, about there's dirty laundry between initiatives. The county and the city, we have not always worked well together. And I'll be the first to say that. I think there's stuff that happens, you get turfy, you get ego comes into play. And I think what's happened in the last couple years is that there's been a shift inside the city on the team where it's folks, and I want to really give some love to Senite Brown and Gabriela Sanchez, who came in as young folks into the city. They're no longer there, but really pushed to say, how do we be about community? And pushed on me personally, pushed on all of us to do the kinds of things, Michael, actually, you've been doing for a long time, forever, as have Mary Flowers and others. And I'm feeling hopeful seeing, Larry, you talk about the work that's happening at the county, and to see the city and county come together is, for folks up north, that's actually so huge and so important. And we're so much more powerful together, and we're more powerful because both institutions are saying, how do we do the work that the community is telling us to do? Because that's also the shift that hasn't happened enough. So I want to thank you all for leading that work and being about that and really going there. And just if for a quick bit before we go to questions, if each of you could say, two-parter, something that you're feeling hopeful about in terms of current efforts that are happening right now in the city and our county and our community. And then if there is some specific advice, I think, Larry, you started to give that in terms of if you're working for an elected, what that looks like and what some of that strategy looks like. But for others of you, if there's sort of a word of advice that you would give to folks here as being somebody who works in the city, county, or in community, what that would be. And I'm going to start on this end, Chris. I'm going to start here with you, if you don't mind.
Let's see. So, one of the things I'm really, really fortunate to do is I serve on the board of the Seattle Indian Health Board, and what I see that gives me incredible hope is that in the Native community, there are 3 amazing organizations: United Indians, Seattle Indian Health Board, and Chief Seattle Club, and both Chief Seattle Club and Seattle Indian Health Board have some of the coolest, most powerful, dynamic young women Native leaders, and United Indians has a pretty good leader too. So I'm really hopeful about I think it's really the power in the community space that Natives are once again taking over. Bit of advice, I guess, is that from the Human Rights Commission perspective, sometimes it's really helpful to exert some pain. And so, the first thing I got involved with when I joined was, helping to shoot down Councilmember Tim Burgess's aggressive panhandling or aggressive solicitation proposal. And so when we got to, we didn't get 5 votes, but we got 4, which was enough to sustain a veto. But that made a lot of difference. And then after that, we went and tried to, work with every single individual council member. And it really did help to have the backing of SOCR, and so there's that kind of, just introducing yourself to them, and introducing yourself, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a more aggressive way, but either way, let them know who you are.
One of the things I'm hopeful about is the brilliance of young people and families that are struggling. As we know, it's not easy to be poor in a capitalist system. It's the most difficult challenge imaginable to be poor in this society with all the different measurements that we see. So the community is like this, still this untapped resource. They know directly what we talk about in theory in terms of struggling. They know what they need. They know the type of healing mechanisms that need to be put in place institutionally. They know how the systems need to be dismantled in terms of how they're working against them. So I'm really inspired by that, which leads to the second point of the challenge to us as a people. I'm wondering how many of us come into regular contact with the people that we say we're working on behalf of. It's easy to drift away from the population of people, but they are the experts in terms of struggle in this society, even doing this work. And I got to give a shout out to Larry Gossett, because he's the only person I have to answer to. He knows when I'm on a panel for 12 years, I will be critical of King County government, City of Seattle government. I will talk in straight, sometimes graphic ways about race, and he's okay with it. I've killed my chances of getting hired in any other place in King County, but that's okay. You go into it measuring those risks, and so I need to give a shout out to him too. But again, in terms of really empowering the community to lead in this work, what are we doing? In King County, we know exactly where the kids are that are in poverty and where the families are. We know by school district and even by individual schools what schools suspend, expel, and miseducate most of our kids. We know whether they call it the census tracts, where undocumented folks are living, and they're still wary of our government institutions because they have an inherent understanding about how they really work. We know that it costs $93,000 to keep one adult incarcerated for a year. It costs more to keep a youth incarcerated for a year. But the budgetary decisions we make don't follow that. What could you do with that $93,000 or that $112,000 for several families, for several individuals, if we change the way that we do business? This is the work that we have to do. And lastly, one of the things that we've seen in King County, and I know we've seen it, I saw it early in the city of Seattle, and what we're seeing now on a national level is this pushback by white folks. They are afraid of losing their privilege, and so now they're putting themselves in the position of being the ultimate victims, which is not anything new. That's been done historically. All of us need to push against that. We're seeing it in King County on a daily basis. There probably, and this is anecdotal, but there may be more acts of discrimination now, and I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Probably more acts of subtle discrimination and implicit bias now than there was before, because there's this fear in the air. People feel like they're at risk of losing their privilege. All of us that work for government, you hear the whispers, you hear the offhand remarks. Regardless of what you look like or who the target of that remark is, we need to challenge it. Because, it's not so much keeping people in silence, it's educating people about the history of this country and how it was really designed to work at its core. There's still a whole lot of folks that are in denial about that, regardless of how many trainings they go to or how often they see the initials of RSJI or ESJ. We, as people who are paid by the public, all of the folks, and poor folks pay a higher percentage of their income to taxes than anybody else does. We have an inherent obligation to do that work on their behalf. When we internalize that and we challenge it at every front, then things will begin to move forward a little bit faster.
I would say that one thing that I'm hopeful for is I talked a bit about how, because the infrastructure was built early on for RSJI, we get to sort of be philosophical about some things. And one of the things that we've been philosophical about is we have this phrase that we use where we say, you can't dismantle systems until you've dismantled yourself. And what that means is really understanding the things that we buy into, understanding how we're situated in this world to harm each other, and what does it mean for us to move from our humanity rather than moving from our trauma or moving from our ego. And what has been really hopeful about that is we started doing at the city an internalized racial oppression training, internalized racial superiority for white folks and internalized racial inferiority for folks of color. Has anyone been? So moving moments in there, and what we are trying to build with that work is to understanding what collective solidarity means. If we can't understand that my freedom is predicated on your freedom, then none of us will ever be free. And what that means is we need to understand how each of us have been exploited just differently. This system of oppression, white supremacy, has exploited all of us just differently. And what we keep doing is fighting each other and not fighting the problem. And what that's done is kept us in this space where we keep having to find solutions for structural racism or institutional racism or interpersonal racism, because we've not dismantled inside of ourselves how we buy into that system. And so it's really exciting and hopeful for me when we sit in that room and talk about how me as a Black woman, I don't get free until I understand how Latinx folks are exploited. Or Asian folks can't get free until they understand the erasure of indigenous folks and that exploitation. And that all of our collective resistance is tied together. And that if we practice oppression in any of those arenas, none of us will ever get free. And I really have been hopeful. One of the things we found is that those classes are oversold. There's too many people and not enough space. And that is just shows for me the cry that the people need about what does it feel like to be in this institution, trying to move this institution, and the harm that's constantly getting done every day, right? It's hopeful for me for white folks to understand that whiteness is a system, not a people, and that white folks have to get free of whiteness. Because if we can't get free of whiteness, none of us can be free, right? And whiteness includes things like toxic masculinity, right? Like it's harming young folks in major degrees, but we don't talk about that, right? And so we have to understand how this system of whiteness is harming all of us, and that our collective liberation is tied together, because there's nothing new under the sun. Nothing new. That same wheel has been used to erase indigenous folks and exploit the resources. It's the same system that is currently keeping Asian folks in that framework of like perpetual foreigner, where folks are like, no, really, where are you from? Yeah, Detroit, right? That if we don't understand how those things are tied together, we actually can't get free, not near one of us. And if one of us gets free, what's gonna happen is we're gonna replicate a messed up power system where we wield harm in harmful ways. And so our liberations are tied together, and that's what's been hopeful, is we've understood what the solutions are at all of these tiers of racism, but beginning to understand what the solution are for our trauma and ourself has been really hopeful. I would say that my specific advice to folks, Larry said that he's constantly critical. Be critical. Be critical. And what that also means is that you'll be offended and you'll be uncomfortable. There's this phrase we also use at RSJI: when you go out to the community, if the community has something painful to say to you, you don't get a cookie for showing up, right? Like you have to sit and you have to hear that and you have to be uncomfortable because that's your barometer. That tells you if you're doing a good job or not, right? Not because you're getting more funding for your program. Like that doesn't tell you if you're doing good. That just tells you you're able to articulate the argument, right? But the folks in the community are the ones that are gonna tell us what that harm looks like to them, and you don't get a cookie for showing up. People are like, oh, I don't like it, it hurts so bad. It should hurt so bad because we're still churning out racist outcomes, right? The other thing I would say is imagine, I learned this actually from my friend Reagan Price, who's the RSJI manager at City Light. And Reagan constantly says, we actually can't imagine something different because we're so steeped and stuck in our harm. And that as children, we imagine things that don't yet exist. But as we become adults, we've sort of got socialized into we can only imagine what we see. And so be creative, imagine is one of the things that I'm learning this year, is to imagine what something different might look like, because what we have isn't what we have to have.
So I'm going to try and make this short, but I think that one of my lessons learned, and I remind myself of this. I had the pleasure of when I first started doing my work, I was able to center community in my work in ways that, when I look back on it, it's like, wow, that was really different. And what that looked like was that we centered our work on what community priorities and needs, which meant that we had to ask, which meant that we had to develop a relationship, right? And it's one of those things that sticks with that really sticks with me to this day. Is just the really importance to align my work, to align our work with community priorities and needs. I work with Seattle Public Utilities, and even though those services are really important, it's not always a community priority, right? And I've learned that it's really important for me to align myself and my work with community priorities and needs. And even though they're dealing with housing issues, they're dealing with, issues around, access to education, I need to not only align myself with those issues, but I need to develop relationships with folks who are working on those issues within their institutions, and to support them to do better, to support them to engage, and to support them to listen. And it's really important, right, because it's really easy working in this large institution called city government, county government, to get lost and to forget, right, as to why we're here. And I can't really say enough about the importance of alignment with community. I also want to say really briefly that, a few years ago, when the initiative decided to go out into the community, it really caused an incredible fracture. And it wasn't just because the initiative decided that it was going to be externally focused. It really spoke to just where we were as a city, where we were as a movement, and the importance for us to grow up, right? For us to come together. And we had become so dependent on folks who were leading the initiative that for some of us, it was really difficult to try and figure out where to go from here. We were also facing a tremendous amount of, folks been there, done that. The initiative was, going on 10 years old, and, it was like it was time to move on, right? And, that's what the institution was saying. And there was, a lot of work that has happened, a lot of work that continues that needs to happen. But I really can't say enough about what a turbulent time we've come through, right? Folks that have been doing this work, we've been through hell, right? And we're here to make sure that the next generation, to make sure that the current generation, that we don't forget that we need to learn from our mistakes. We need to learn and we need to grow from that. And, I want to say that the thing that gives me the most hope because I really do look to SOCR, I look to my other city sister departments, I look to you all to help me make sure that I'm on point. I look to my team, the Environmental Justice and Service Equity Division, to help to make sure that we are speaking truth to power. And I really can't say enough about Tamara Zier, right, and Kyana Wheeler, for their work to really get us back on track. You know, Sinead Brown and Gabby Sanchez Stearns' names were mentioned. We weren't ready for them. We weren't ready for them. And what happened to them, we can't let it happen to anyone else, right? We can't let it happen to anyone else. I'll be honest, I'm the first one that's guilty of that. I watched those women get run out of city government, right? We can't do that to each other anymore, right? But I do want to lift up, you know, Tamar, I love you. I don't know where you are right now, but, you know, your leadership is golden. We need to honor and we need to respect her leadership in doing this work. I also want to lift up a couple of folks. I see one of them sitting back there, Manal Alansi. She was the facilitator for the panel yesterday, doing some amazing work at Department of Transportation. And you know, we already mentioned our friend Reagan Price. And I just share that because these are some women who've really been there for me. Patricia Bell Wyrick, along with Natalie Hunter, have been folks who I've turned to, particularly in the last couple of years, to help me find my true north, right? To help make sure that I'm grounded and I'm straight. So, you know, my lessons learned is like, you know, we have to look out for each other, we have to love each other, we have to speak truth to each other, and we have to remember that where we are meant to be, regardless of what others may say or what they may think about us. Thank you.
Okay, we are at 12.